Almax was hot in a way that had nothing to do with weather. Heat gathered under chandeliers, trapped in silk and sweat and perfume, pressed into the room by 100 polite smiles that meant judgment. Fans fluttered like small white wings. Diamond rings clicked against crystal stems. The string quartet played a waltz with perfect manners, each note smooth enough to hide a knife. Lady Emma Vale stood near the refreshments table with a glass of lemonade that had gone lukewarm. The condensation dampened her gloves, and the thin leather clung to her fingers like a second skin. She kept her posture straight because a drooping spine invited pity, and pity was its own kind of execution. 26. The number sat on her tongue like ash. A catastrophic age to still be unclaimed, still unchosen, still left standing beside the silver tray as if she were part of the decor. Her gown was lavender silk, fine fabric in a shade that had been fashionable years ago. Not disgraceful, not daring, safe enough to be ignored. Emma was used to being invisible. Most nights, she preferred it. Across the assembly rooms, the center of gravity shifted. Conversation rippled, then tightened. A small surge of bodies angled toward the doorway as if pulled by a hidden cord. Sebastian Belinda, the 8th Duke of Harriet, entered with the ease of a man who never worried about being turned away. He was tall, dark-haired, and too handsome for his own good, the kind of beauty that made young debutantes forget how to breathe. Tonight, he was not brooding. Tonight, he was drunk. He carried a crystal goblet that caught the chandelier light and threw it back in hard little flashes. The scent of expensive tobacco followed him, cedar and smoke wrapped around the sweeter sting of French brandy. He moved toward the orchestra like he owned the music as well, a circle of men forming around him in practiced worship. Lord Frederick Mouton was there, oily and eager, laughter ready before the Duke finished a sentence. The young Viscount Elling hovered close, eyes wide, learning what it looked like to be loud without consequence. "The season is a meat market," Sebastian announced, voice carrying over the quartet's polite strains. A parade of fillies, herded by mothers with calculators for hearts. A few men laughed too quickly. A few ladies smiled too tightly. One of the patronesses lifted her fan, not to cool herself, but to hide her mouth. Lord Frederick tittered. "Surely there is one flower in the garden you would wish to pluck, Harriet." Sebastian's laugh came out harsh, barking. It bounced off the walls and made the air feel smaller. His gaze swept the room with the ease of a predator who knew he had no natural enemies. Emma felt it before it landed on her, the way a shadow moves across a table. She kept her face still, her shoulders composed, as if stillness could make her disappear completely. His eyes caught her and held. Recognition flickered there, but not the kind that saw a person. It was the recognition of a role, the perpetual wallflower, the woman who had been rejected before she learned how to hope, the one the room had decided would never change. Sebastian lifted his goblet in her direction, the amber liquid sloshing near the rim. "That one," he slurred, and the words cut cleanly through the waltz. "Lady Emma, the what do they call you, Vale spinster?" The nearest conversations died as if someone had pinched their throats. A fan stilled mid-flutter. A ring tapped a glass once, then went quiet. Even the string quartet seemed to hesitate, a single note stretching too long before the musicians recovered. Emma's stomach dropped, but she did not move. She stared at the damp outline her lemonade left on the silver tray, as if focusing on something small could keep something large from crushing her. Sebastian took a step forward. The crowd parted for him without thinking. He was cruel when he drank, cruelty worn like armor against boredom. "Look at her standing there," he said, gesturing with his glass, like a statue of mediocrity. "I wager she has never felt a rapid heartbeat in her life. She's as exciting as a wet Sunday in Shropshire." A ripple of nervous laughter skittered across the room and died. Lord Frederick's grin faltered when he realized no one else was daring to laugh. Emma's fingers tightened around her glove seams. She could feel her pulse now, loud and sharp in her throat, and the irony tasted like metal. Someone hissed, low and urgent, "Your Grace," as if the words might shove him back behind a veil of manners. Sebastian ignored it. He enjoyed the silence too much. Emma set her lemonade down. The glass touched the silver tray with a small, delicate clink. The sound was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was simply precise, like the closing of a book. In the room's sudden stillness, it rang like a bell. Heads turned, not toward Sebastian, but toward her. Emma stepped away from the table. A lady did not do that. A lady swallowed humiliation and wore it as charm. A lady retreated to a corner, blotted her eyes, and pretended she had not been wounded. Emma walked straight toward the Duke. The air between them felt thick, heavy with perfume and expectation. As she approached, she could smell the brandy more clearly, sweet and sharp, cutting through cedar and smoke. She stopped a few feet from him, close enough to see the smear of careless confidence at the corner of his mouth, close enough to see how his pupils struggled to focus. "Your Grace," Emma said. Her voice did not tremble. Sebastian blinked down at her, surprised that the furniture had spoken. "It must be a heavy burden," she continued, calm as a knife sliding from a sheath, "to be so vastly superior to everyone else." A gasp ran through the room. It was not loud, but it moved like a wind. Someone's fan snapped open too hard. The quartet kept playing, but the notes sounded thinner, as if the musicians were suddenly afraid. Sebastian's smile tightened. The fog of alcohol shifted, irritation sparking under it. "What?" he demanded. "To be so perfect," Emma said, meeting his gaze without flinching, "that you feel entitled to humiliate those who have done you no wrong." Lord Frederick looked as though he might faint. Viscount Elling stared at Emma as if she had produced a pistol at the refreshments table. Sebastian stepped closer, towering, the menace in him waking. "I speak only the truth," he said, voice dropping. "You are decorative furniture, harmless, useless." Emma tilted her head, and the movement was small, almost polite. "Useless," she repeated. "I wager I can do many things better than you, Your Grace. Apart from drinking, of course. You clearly have the advantage there." A nervous laugh escaped someone before they could swallow it. It sounded like a mistake. Sebastian's jaw tightened. Pride, brittle and massive, flared bright. He was not used to being mocked. Not here. Not by her. "Name it," he challenged. The words pushed out like a shove. Cards, horses, poetry. Emma did not look away. She did not glance around for help. The room was not going to save her. The room was watching to see if she would break. "Shooting," she said. The word landed and stayed. Heavy, simple, impossible. For a heartbeat, Sebastian only stared. Then he threw his head back and laughed, loud enough to shake the chandeliers. "Shooting?" he wheezed, wiping at an eye as if she had gifted him a fine joke. "You with a pistol? You'd break your wrist from the recoil. You'd faint at the smell of powder." Emma's expression did not change. "Is that a refusal, Your Grace?" His laughter faltered. "Is the Duke of Harriet afraid?" she asked, voice steady. "Of a spinster?" The room held its breath. Even the music seemed to shrink. Sebastian's eyes narrowed. He stepped in close enough that Emma could smell the brandy like a threat. "Very well," he sneered. "Tomorrow at dawn. Hyde Park. 20 paces. Target shooting." He lifted his goblet, performing for his audience, for his pride, for the version of himself that could not tolerate a woman standing still and unafraid. "And to make it interesting," he said, voice sharpening, "we set a wager." Emma's heart hammered, but her face stayed quiet. "I have no money that would interest you." "I do not want your money," Sebastian said, and his smile was cruel. He looked around the room, soaking in the attention like heat. "If you win, if you can actually best me, I will grant you the only thing you women seem to want." A pause, a hook, a room of mouths slightly open. "I will marry you," he said, clean and loud. "On the spot. I will make you a duchess." The collective gasp sucked air from the room. Somewhere, a glass trembled against a ring and made a soft, frightened sound. Emma felt the walls of Almack's tighten. A trap had been sprung, and the room did not yet know who had stepped into it. "And if I lose?" Emma asked, voice low. "Then you leave London," Sebastian said, pleasure thinly masked. "You retire to the country and never darken a ballroom with your presence again." Emma looked up at him. She saw the cruelty. She saw the boredom. She saw the confidence of a man who had never been told no and never learned what fear felt like. She also saw 50 witnesses, hungry for blood, waiting for her to fold. Emma did not fold. "Accepted," she said. The word was quiet. It did not need to be loud. It was final. She turned and walked out of Almack's with her head high. Silk brushed silk as she passed, and the crowd parted as if she carried fire. Behind her, the quartet played on, the waltz, pretending nothing had happened. Outside, the night air hit her like cold water. Her breath came sharp, fast, hidden in the shadow of the doorway. Inside her chest, her heart pounded a rhythm that had nothing to do with fear alone. It sounded like a countdown. She had not fired a gun in 6 years. Emma did not run when she reached the street, but the cool air felt too clean, too sharp, as if London itself had stepped back to watch what she had done. The noise of Almack's stayed behind the closed doors, muffled into something harmless. Out here, the night was quieter, and quiet was where fear learned to speak. Her carriage waited at the curb. The footman's lantern threw a pale circle onto the cobblestones. He opened the door with the careful face of a man trained not to react to scandal. Emma stepped inside and sat with her hands folded in her lap, willing them to stay still. The leather seat creaked. The carriage rocked as the horses started, and the city began to slide past the window iron railings, shuttered shops, the occasional flare of a street lamp in a puddle. Emma watched her reflection in the glass. Her eyes looked darker than they had inside, the gray sharpened by night. Her pulse was still too loud. At home, the servants moved as if the house were made of thin ice. A maid offered to unpin her hair. Emma shook her head once. She climbed the stairs alone, each step a measured beat against the hush. When she reached her room, she shut the door and leaned her forehead against the wood. Only then did her breath break. The wager replayed with merciless clarity. The laughter, the cruel ease of his voice, the way the room had turned her humiliation into entertainment. Her throat tightened. Not with tears not yet, but with the old ache of being measured and found wanting by people who never learned her name. A soft knock sounded. "Lady Emma?" her maid asked from the other side. "Shall I bring you tea?" Emma swallowed. The word no came easily. She was not thirsty for comfort. She was thirsty for control. "Yes," she said, "and paper, and a candle." When the tea arrived, it steamed faintly, smelling of bergamot. The candle's flame made a small, warm pool in the corner of the room. Emma sat at her writing desk and stared at the blank sheet as if it were a target pinned to bark. 20 paces. Hyde Park, dawn. Her fingers hovered over the pen. She did not write. There was no one she could appeal to who would not turn her plea into gossip. She could not ask for mercy. Not from the Ton, not from Sebastian, not from fate. She took a slow breath through her nose and let it out through her mouth. Careful, controlled. The movement steadied her shoulders. For a moment, the air smelled of ink and wax and distant chimney smoke. Her gaze drifted to the small wooden box in the bottom drawer of the desk, the one she almost never opened. It was not locked. It did not need to be. No one thought she owned anything worth stealing. Emma slid it out and lifted the lid. Inside lay a pair of kid leather gloves, older than the ones she wore to assemblies, the fingertips slightly darkened with use. Beneath them, wrapped in cloth, was a small brass tool she recognized instantly. A flint screwdriver, its handle worn smooth. A simple thing, practical, unfashionable. Her stomach tightened, not with romance, but with memory. She closed her eyes and saw a cold northern morning, the pale sun caught in bare branches, the crack of a shot echoing across empty fields. She saw her own hands, smaller then, but steady. She heard a voice that had never coddled her, never softened the truth, only demanded precision. The world is noise. The target is silence. Emma opened her eyes again. A single thought slipped into place with terrifying clarity. Sebastian had wagered on a story he liked, the story where she was harmless, the story where she would flinch and save him the trouble of consequence. He did not know what silence could do in the hands of someone who had lived inside it. Her hands began to move without drama. She changed out of her lavender gown into a simple night shift, then wrapped herself in a dark robe. She crossed to the washstand and scrubbed the sweat and perfume from her skin until her cheeks stung. The mirror showed her face as plain as ever, no sudden transformation, no magic, just a woman with eyes that watched and never showed her work. She set the old gloves on the bed. Then she sat at the edge of the mattress and pressed her palms against her thighs, forcing her breath to slow. The terror was real. It had teeth. It reminded her of time. 6 years was long enough for skills to dull, for confidence to rot, for a single mistake to become a public death. And yet, beneath the fear, something else burned. Anger. Not hot, not loud, cold and exact. She pictured the line of his jaw as he laughed, the way he had taken a room full of people and used it like a weapon. She pictured the word spinster shaping itself on tongues that had never done anything brave. Her fingers curled against the fabric of her robe. She stood. The house slept around her, but Emma moved through it like a ghost with purpose. She did not need to wake anyone. She did not need permission. She pulled a shawl over her shoulders and went down the back stairs, careful to keep the boards from creaking. In the dark corridor near the pantry, she paused, listening. Silence, thick, honest. She found the small door that led to the storage rooms and opened it. The air inside smelled of dust and old wood. Her hand brushed shelves, searching by memory and touch. She did not know exactly what she would find, only that noble houses kept inconvenient objects in inconvenient places. A wooden case sat on the lowest shelf, shoved behind a stack of unused candelabras. It was long and narrow, the kind of shape that did not belong to linens. Emma's heart stuttered once. She drew it out slowly and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, lay a pistol. Not a dueling pair. A single piece, older, its metal duller than fashionable shine. It smelled faintly of oil. Emma did not touch it at first. She stared, as if the object might accuse her of becoming someone she was not allowed to be. Then, she reached in and lifted it. The weight settled into her palm with an intimacy that startled her. Familiar, unforgiving. The grip pressed against the crease of her hand like an old handshake. Emma checked the flint. The motion was small and sure. She checked the pan. She did not fumble. Her fingers remembered the logic of parts, the way one piece demanded the next, the way carelessness turned into misfire. A sharp exhale left her mouth, almost a laugh, except it had no joy in it. She set the pistol back in its velvet cradle and closed the case. For a moment she held it against her chest, feeling the solid certainty of wood and metal. Tomorrow at dawn, the ton would arrive to watch a woman fail. They would come to witness comedy. They would come to witness a duke's arrogance rewarded. Emma carried the case back to her room and placed it under the bed. She did not sleep. She lay in the dark and listened to the city settle, to distant wheels and far-off shouting. Each sound floated away and left her with the one thing she understood better than anyone in that room of glittering predators: silence. When morning finally began to pale the edges of the curtains, Emma rose. She bathed, dressed, braided her hair tight, and pinned it without softness. She chose a dark riding habit that allowed her to move, severe enough to look like a decision. She pulled on her gloves and felt the leather tighten around her fingers. Downstairs, the household stirred into anxious motion. A servant asked if she would like breakfast. No, Emma said. The word came out calm. It did not need explanation. Outside, the air smelled of damp earth and early smoke. Her breath fogged once and vanished. The carriage lantern flickered as she stepped in, the pistol case concealed beneath a blanket as if it were nothing more than a book. As the wheels began to roll toward Hyde Park, Emma stared at the pale line of dawn forming over the rooftops and let a single sentence settle in her mind, not as comfort, but as instruction. He does not know what I am. And he will. Hyde Park, in the hour before sunrise, looked unfinished. Mist lay thick over the grass, curling around boots and carriage wheels, softening the sharp lines of trees into silhouettes. The air tasted of wet earth and coal smoke drifting from distant chimneys. Somewhere beyond the fog, a bird tried a single note and stopped, as if it too sensed an audience. The crowd was larger than it had any right to be. Gentlemen in dark coats huddled in clusters, breath ghosting from their mouths. A few daring ladies sat inside carriages with the windows cracked, watching through lace and curiosity. Coins changed hands quietly. A laugh slipped out, then died when it met the cold. Sebastian Belinda stood near his carriage, pale in the gray light. The brandy had abandoned him and left behind its punishment. His head throbbed like a nail driven into bone. He adjusted his cravat with fingers that felt clumsy, his stomach turning each time he caught the smell of damp wool. He told himself this was absurd. A bit of theater. a joke gone too far that he could smooth over with charm and money. And yet his eyes kept searching the fog as if it might spare him by keeping one carriage from appearing. A murmur ran through the spectators, low and quick. "She's here." A modest black carriage rolled out of the mist. Its lanterns glowed faintly, small moons in a pale world. The door opened and Lady Emma Vale stepped down. She wore no silk, no lavender, no ornaments meant to soften her into something agreeable. A dark riding habit clung close enough to show it had been chosen for movement. Her hair was pulled back in a tight braid. No bonnet, no trembling. She looked smaller than the oak trees behind her and harder than the air. Sebastian walked toward her, the grass wet under his boots. He tried to summon the old arrogance, but it came up hollow. "Lady Emma," he said, keeping his voice low, "I am surprised. I assumed you would come to your senses." "I am not in the habit of breaking promises, Your Grace," she replied. Up close, her face showed the night she had not slept, dark shadows beneath her eyes, a paleness that made her gray gaze look like steel. But her hands, gloved in kid leather, hung steady at her sides. He glanced at the crowd. Men were already leaning forward, hungry. "We can call this off," he said. "Urgent now. Go home. I will tell them I apologized. We end it fast." Emma studied him as if he were a target, and she were measuring distance. "And admit you are right," she said softly. He opened his mouth, then shut it. "No," Emma said. "One syllable. Clean. Final." A man stepped forward carrying a mahogany case. Colonel Tobias Halloway had the build of someone who had survived wars and learned to enjoy other people's risk. His voice carried easily through the fog. "The weapons," he announced, flipping open the case. 2 pistols lay in velvet, their metal dark and elegant. Manton dueling pistols, flintlock, hair triggers, rifled barrels. Sebastian took one. The familiar weight settled into his hand like an old vice, comforting, reliable. He was a sportsman. He had fired in Scotland and Norfolk, in autumn sunlight and winter wind. He told himself that skill did not vanish because of one bad night. Emma took the other pistol. Sebastian watched closely, expecting the awkwardness men joked about in drawing rooms. A lady holding a firearm like a dead fish, a flinch, a fumble. Emma did neither. She checked the flint with a small twist of her fingers. She checked the priming pan. She moved as if the pistol were not a symbol but a tool. The motions were economical, practiced, almost indifferent. A chill slid under Sebastian's skin. Colonel Halloway gestured toward an oak tree whose dark trunk rose out of the mist like a judge. "The target," he called. An ace of spades pinned to the oak. 20 paces. A runner jogged out, the sound of his boots faint on wet ground. He pinned the card to bark. The white rectangle looked absurdly small at that distance, a scrap of paper asking to be harmed. The crowd murmured. Coins clinked. A carriage horse snorted, restless. "Ladies first," Sebastian said, forcing a grin that did not reach his eyes. Emma stepped to the mark. She did not look at the crowd. She did not glance at Sebastian. Her attention narrowed until the world fell away. Mist, whispers, money, reputation noise. For a heartbeat, her eyes closed. Her shoulders lowered on a slow inhale. Her grip adjusted by a fraction. Kid leather creaked softly at the bend of her knuckles. Then her eyes opened, and the card became the only thing that existed. She raised her arm. There was no theatrical hesitation, no flutter, no plea for luck. The flint struck. A sharp click, small, precise, then the crack of the shot tore the morning open. Smoke burst white and thick, rolling around her like a veil. The smell of sulfur hit hard, stinging the back of Sebastian's throat. For a moment, he could not see her at all. Only the shape of her stance remained in his mind. Balanced, locked, unshaken. The runner sprinted toward the tree. Every head turned with him. Time felt stretched thin, pulled by anticipation. He yanked the card from the bark and ran back, his face draining as he approached Colonel Halloway. He held the card out with both hands as if it might burn him. Halloway took it and stared. His mouth opened slightly, then shut, as if the words had to force their way past disbelief. "Dead center," the colonel said at last. His voice cracked on the second word. Through the spade. The card passed into the light, and for one suspended second it looked unreal. A clean hole punched through black ink, the paper's edge around it faintly scorched. The crowd did not cheer immediately. They could not. Their lungs had forgotten how. Then the noise came all at once, shouts, laughter, curses, the frantic clatter of coins being reclaimed or surrendered. Someone in a carriage let out a sharp, delighted cry. Lord Frederick's voice rose above the others, too shrill. Luck, he insisted. Pure, blind luck. Sebastian stepped forward as if pulled by a string. Now it was his turn. The pistol felt heavier, not because it had changed, but because everything had. He was no longer shooting for sport. He was shooting for his dignity, for the joke he had thrown like a stone, for the life he had assumed he could control with one sentence. He lifted his arm. His hangover made the world tilt slightly. The sulfur still burned in his nose. His hand trembled, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for him to feel it like betrayal. He fired. The crack sounded smaller this time, swallowed by the crowd's breathing. Smoke drifted. The runner went to the tree, slower now, as if he already feared what he would bring back. He returned with the card. Colonel Holloway examined it, eyes narrowing. "The Duke," Holloway said, and cleared his throat, "has clipped the edge of the card." A pause, sharp as a snapped thread. "But he has not hit the spade." A sound escaped Sebastian that was not quite a laugh and not quite a curse. His stomach dropped. The grass seemed too wet under his boots. His mouth tasted like copper. Emma lowered her pistol. She did not smile. She did not gloat. Her composure made the victory feel colder, more absolute. She turned toward Sebastian, and in her stillness there was something he had failed to read in the assembly rooms. Not softness, not meekness iron. For the first time, he looked at her as a person and not a role. "Who are you?" he whispered, the question slipping out before pride could stop it. "I am Emma Vale," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried through the chaos like a blade through cloth. She handed the pistol back to Colonel Holloway without a tremor. Then she faced the Duke, who had tried to turn her into a joke, and her gray eyes held his with calm certainty. "And I believe, Your Grace," she added, "that we have a wedding to plan." The wedding was too bright and too quiet at the same time. Sunlight poured through the church windows in clean, merciless beams that made every whisper visible. The air smelled of polished wood, beeswax, and damp stone, the familiar sense of sanctity wrapped around something far less holy. Emma stood at the altar beneath a veil thick enough to blur faces into pale smudges. White fabric brushed her wrists. The lace at her throat itched. Her pulse was steady, but her stomach rolled in slow waves as if her body could not decide whether to celebrate or flee. The pews were packed, not with friends, not with warmth, but with witnesses. The ton had arrived like crows to a field, hungry for a spectacle. Eyes followed the hem of her gown, the angle of her shoulders, searching for a crack that would make her story easier to mock. Sebastian stood beside her in immaculate black. His posture was rigid, his jaw tight as if he were holding back words that might poison the air. When the vicar began, his voice droned with practiced certainty, and the promises sounded like legal phrases spoken over a ledger. "I, Sebastian," he said when the moment came, and his voice had no softness in it, only resignation. "Take thee, Emma." His hand, when it took hers, was cold. The ring slid onto her finger with a faint scrape, metal against skin, as if even gold resented being part of this arrangement. Emma kept her chin lifted. She refused to give the room the satisfaction of watching her flinch. As they turned and walked back down the aisle, the murmurs swelled like a tide held behind a dam. Emma heard her name in fragments, carried under breath. Trap. Gunpowder match. Poor Harriet. A laugh, high and unpleasant, threaded through the whispers. Emma's throat tightened, not with tears but with fury. She held it in place with her spine. Outside, the carriage waited, lacquered black and gleaming in the sun. The horses stamped, impatient. The moment Emma stepped inside, the world narrowed to velvet seats and the tight smell of leather and clean starch. Sebastian sat opposite her, staring at his boots, as if they were the only honest thing in his life. The wheels began to roll. London moved beyond the window in flashes, iron fences, stone facades, faces turning, mouths forming words. Neither of them spoke. Silence in a ballroom had been a weapon. Silence in this carriage felt like a sentence. When the carriage stopped at Harriet House, the doors opened onto a grand foyer tiled in black and white marble. The ceiling rose high enough to swallow voices. The air inside was cool and smelled faintly of lemon oil and old money. Servants stood in a line, stiff and watchful. Their eyes flicked to Emma's veil, to her new ring, to Sebastian's face. They knew the circumstances. Houses like this always knew. Sebastian stepped forward first. The heavy oak door closed behind them with a deep, final thud. For a heartbeat, Emma expected something, some acknowledgement, some attempt at civility that might soften the edges of the day. Sebastian turned to her. "Madam," he said, and it sounded strange in his mouth, like a word he had never needed before. "Mrs. Gable will show you to your quarters." "Our quarters?" Emma asked. Her voice came out thin before she could thicken it with control. Sebastian's mouth twisted. A dry, humorless sound left him, almost a laugh. "Do not mistake this legal arrangement for a romance," he said. He pulled off his gloves with a sharp, impatient motion and slapped them into his palm. "You won a wager. You have my title, you have my protection, you have access to my fortune." He stepped closer, and Emma caught the faint scent of cedar and soap clinging to him, too clean for a day like this. "But you do not have me," he finished. The words landed hard, not because they surprised her, but because he spoke them like a punishment she had earned. "I will continue my life as I see fit," he said. "I will spend my evenings where I choose. You will manage the household, look decorative at functions, and ensure the Harriet name is not dragged further into the mud than you have already dragged it." Emma's nails pressed into her palms beneath her gloves. She tasted iron at the back of her throat. "I see," she managed. He watched her as if waiting for her to beg, to apologize, to shrink back into the role he understood. "And if I desire companionship?" she asked, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. Sebastian's eyes narrowed. "Buy a dog," he said. Then he turned on his heel and walked out, the polished floor reflecting his retreat, like a mirror that refused to look away. The front door opened. Cold air rushed in. The oak slammed shut behind him with a reverberation that shook the foyer. The sound was too familiar, not the crack of a pistol, but close enough to it that Emma's nerves reacted as if it were gunfire. She stood alone in the center of the marble, the veil still over her face, her ring catching sunlight in a hard, indifferent flash. Mrs. Gable cleared her throat. The housekeeper was a broad woman with hands that looked capable, her expression strained between sympathy and caution. "Your Grace," she said quietly, and the title felt new, heavy, awkward. Emma inhaled once. Deep, controlled. The air smelled of wax and stone and something neglected beneath it all. Tears pricked, hot and unwanted. Emma blinked them back until her eyes stung. She would not cry in this echoing hall. She would not give the servants a story to carry downstairs. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm. "Mrs. Gable," Emma said, turning toward her with deliberate composure, "please prepare a bath." The housekeeper nodded quickly, almost relieved to be given something practical. "And bring me the household ledgers," Emma added. Mrs. Gable hesitated. "The accounts, Your Grace." "Yes," Emma said. She reached up and lifted her veil back, letting cool air touch her face. Her reflection flickered in the polished marble, pale, controlled, unbroken. "If I am to run this house," Emma continued, each word set in place like a nail, "I intend to do it efficiently." A faint sound came from somewhere down the corridor, perhaps a servant shifting, perhaps a distant clock beginning to tick. The house seemed to listen. Emma walked forward into Harriet House without looking back, her skirt whispering against marble, her ring heavy on her finger, her spine straight as a gun barrel. The wager had given her a title. Now she would make it a weapon. 2 weeks into the marriage, Harriet House began to reveal its true nature. Not a palace, but a museum of neglect. Money had been poured into it like perfume, expensive, temporary, meant to disguise the rot. The carpets were thick, the mirrors spotless, the silver polished until it flashed like teeth. But behind doors that were rarely opened, dust sat in corners like quiet accusations. The library smelled of damp paper. The garden paths disappeared under weeds. Emma learned the house the way she had once learned distance, by noticing what others overlooked. A footman's limp, A seam in the drapes repaired twice in the same spot. The rhythm of the household clock that ran fast by 3 minutes, as if even time here was impatient. At breakfast, Sebastian remained a polite stranger. His chair sat so far from hers the long table might have hosted a cricket match. He spoke in correct fragments about weather and schedules, never looking at her ring. His tea never cooled. He drank it too quickly and left. Emma did not ask where he went. Not because she did not care, but because questions were a kind of surrender, and she had learned to survive without permission. Instead, she read, "Ledgers arrived tied with ribbon and faintly scented with dust." Mrs. Gable brought them with the careful reverence people reserved for objects that could ruin reputations. Emma sat in the blue drawing room with the morning light pale on the pages, and she counted income, expenditures, wages, coal, wine, repairs, all of it large, all of it manageable, until it wasn't. She saw the line items that did not belong. Payments made monthly, identical sums, as regular as rent, not to tailors or jewelers or horse breeders. Names written in a hand that pressed too hard into the paper, ink slightly smeared as if the writer's fingers had been sweating. Mr. Silas Vane. The Rookery Syndicate. £5,000. Emma's breath caught. The number was obscene. Not a season's indulgence, not a week's foolishness. It was a bleed, a slow, deliberate draining. The door to Sebastian's private study was at the end of a corridor she had been told politely not to enter. A boundary drawn by servants' eyes rather than locks. Emma walked there anyway, her slippers soundless on the runner carpet, the house holding its breath around her. The study smelled like leather bindings and smoke that had been left to settle into the wood. The curtains were half drawn. A decanter sat untouched, the amber inside catching a thin slice of light. The desk was orderly in the way a battlefield could be orderly after the bodies were cleared. Emma moved to the desk and lifted the top ledger she had found in the household accounts. Her fingers traced the numbers again, slower, colder. The sums were too clean to be gambling, too consistent, too methodical. A sound behind her. Not loud, not dramatic, just the soft shift of a boot on carpet. "What are you doing?" Emma turned. Sebastian stood in the doorway with his cravat loosened, hair disheveled, the crisp perfection of the Duke undone by something sharper than hangover. His eyes were bright with fury and something else, panic, raw and unhidden. "I was looking for a book," Emma said, and heard how thin it sounded in this room. Sebastian crossed the distance in 3 long strides. He snatched the ledger from under her hand and slammed it shut with a crack that felt like a slap. "You have no business here," he hissed. His face was pale. A bead of sweat clung near his temple despite the room's coolness. Emma had seen him cruel, arrogant, bored. She had not seen him afraid. "That is not a gambling debt," Emma said, keeping her voice steady through the sudden throb of adrenaline. "Who is Silas Vane? Why are you paying him £5,000 a month?" Sebastian's jaw flexed. His eyes flicked to the door as if he expected someone else to appear. His voice dropped. "Get out!" Emma did not move. The floor beneath her felt solid, the way the mark in Hyde Park had felt solid beneath her boots. "I am your wife," she said. "Your debts are my debts." "You cannot help me," Sebastian snapped, and the words were loud enough that they scraped the air. Then he stopped himself, as if the sound had betrayed him. His shoulders rose and fell once, hard. "You think," he said, and his voice trembled with something like anguish. "Because you can shoot a pistol? You understand the world? You understand nothing, Emma, nothing." He gripped the edge of the desk until his knuckles went white. "If you value your life," he said, each word forced through his teeth, "you will forget that name. You will forget you saw this book. And you will never come in this room again." The threat should have frozen her. It should have sent her back into the corridor with her pride swallowed like medicine. Instead, it anchored her. Emma studied him. In the tightness around his eyes, in the rigid way he held himself, she saw a truth that shifted the entire shape of the problem. Sebastian was not protecting his pleasures. He was protecting something that could destroy him. "I cannot forget," Emma said softly. She stepped closer, slow enough to be deliberate. Sebastian did not move, but his breath hitched as if she had approached with a blade. "I am the Duchess of Harriet now," she continued. and her voice held the same calm certainty it had held when she accepted the wager. "And I do not lose." For a heartbeat, they stood close enough that Emma could smell the faint trace of smoke clinging to his coat and something metallic beneath it, like a coin held too long in a warm hand. Then Emma walked past him, her shoulder brushing his arm. He did not pull away. His body stayed rigid, but the contact landed like a crack in stone. Emma left the study with her pulse loud in her ears. The corridor seemed darker than before, the portraits along the walls watching with painted indifference. Each step back toward the staircase felt like crossing a line she would not be allowed to uncross. Upstairs, in the quiet of her room, she closed the door and leaned against it. Her fingers were cold, her mouth tasted faintly of ink, as if the numbers had stained her. Outside, rain began to tap against the window, small, impatient knocks. Emma stared at the gray light and understood something she had not understood in the church, in the carriage, in the marble hall. Winning a wager had been simple. Point, breathe, fire. This was different. This was a house built on secrets, and her husband was not the architect. He was trapped inside it. Emma's gaze drifted to the ring on her finger. Gold, heavy, a symbol that had been meant to secure her future. Now it felt like a key. As thunder rolled far off, slow and warning, Emma pressed her palm flat against the door, as if she could feel the entire house breathing on the other side. The easy part was over. The real game had begun. The package arrived at breakfast, dropped onto the silver tray with a dull thud that made the china tremble. The paper was rough and brown, tied with coarse twine that looked more suited to a butcher's parcel than a duchess's table. There was no crest, no calling card, just weight. Emma's knife paused mid-slice. Butter shone on the blade. Across the long table, Sebastian's cup hovered near his mouth, his gaze sharpening as he saw the twine. Mrs. Gable set the parcel down with careful hands and an expression that tried and failed to be neutral. "Delivered by a boy," she murmured. "No name, Your Grace." Emma slid the parcel toward her. The paper rasped against silver. The twine bit into her glove as she loosened it, slow enough to keep her hands from betraying her pulse. Inside was a single white rose. Perfect, expensive, and wrong. The petals were creamy at the center, but the edges were scorched black, curled as if they had been held over a flame and pulled away at the last moment. The scent still rose sweetly from it, fighting the bitter char. Pinned to the stem was a small note. Emma lifted it. The paper was thin, the ink dark and confident. "The flower fades when the sun sets. Midnight, the masquerade." A faint sound came from Sebastian air, leaving his lungs as if someone had struck him. He reached across the table, snatched the note from her hand, and crushed it in his fist. The crackle was sharp, like dry leaves underfoot. "He knows," Sebastian said. His voice was flat, but his eyes were not. His eyes were pale with shock. "He knows I care about you." Emma kept her face still. She looked at the rose, at the blackened edges, at the deliberate cruelty of beauty ruined on purpose. "He is shifting the target," Sebastian added, and the words came out like a confession he hated making. "The masquerade," Emma said, tasting the phrase like a piece of metal. "Lord Elling's ball." "We are not going," Sebastian snapped, pushing back his chair. Its legs scraped the floor in a harsh protest. He began pacing the length of the table as if motion could outrun consequences. "You'll leave within the hour, the Scottish estate. You will be gone before nightfall." Emma reached for her toast with a steady hand. The bread crackled softly as she broke it. She spread butter as if it were a normal morning and not a threat delivered in petals and ash. "I will not," she said. Sebastian stopped so abruptly it looked as if he had hit a wall. "Emma, if I run," she continued, voice calm, "he sees fear. If he sees fear, he strikes." Sebastian's hand slammed down on the table. The china rattled. A spoon rolled and tapped against a saucer with a bright, nervous clink. "This man is a killer," he said, low and urgent. "He runs 7 dials like a butcher runs a block. He will not hesitate to hurt you to get to me." "Then we must stop him before he does," Emma replied. Sebastian stared at her as if he could not decide whether to admire her or shake her. The line of his mouth tightened. His shoulders rose with a breath he had to force down. "You do not understand what you are offering," he said. Emma's gray gaze did not move. You said he has letters. Where does he keep them? Sebastian's eyelids flickered. The question landed in the one place his fear could not armor. He carries them, he admitted, voice rough. An oilskin pouch, always on his person. He taunts me with it. Emma's mind clicked into place, clean as a mechanism. A target, a distance, a plan. Good, she said. No, Sebastian answered immediately, the word sharp as a slap. Absolutely not. He stepped closer, lowering his voice as if volume itself could summon vain. You are planning something insane. I am planning a win, Emma said. Sebastian's laugh came out short and bitter. At a masquerade? With hundreds of people? You think you can simply, pick his pocket? Emma rose from her chair, her skirt whispered against the floor. The ring on her hand caught light for an instant, a small, hard flash. You will meet him, Emma said. He expects that. He wants you alone, frightened, bargaining. Sebastian shook his head, jaw clenched. And while I distract him, you will. Emma held his gaze until he stopped speaking. I will take the shot, she said quietly. Silence hit the room, heavy and immediate. Even the clock seemed to hesitate between ticks. Sebastian's face drained of color. No, he said again, but the words sounded weaker, more like fear than authority. Emma, you cannot. I can, Emma cut in. I have done it before. That was a card on a tree, Sebastian hissed. This is a man. This is blood. Emma did not look away. He has already spilled yours, she said, and the truth of it made Sebastian flinch. He ran a hand through his hair, breathing hard. The scent of tea and toast had soured into something sharp. If anything happens to you, you do not get to protect me by sending me away, Emma said, her voice low. Not when your enemy has already learned my name. Sebastian's eyes flicked to the scorched rose, still lying on the silver tray like a warning dressed as a gift. He swallowed, his throat moving visibly. You force my hand, he murmured. Emma's expression did not soften, but her tone did, just a fraction. I am already in this, she said. So are you. He looked at her for a long moment. The Duke, who had once treated everything like a game, stood in his own dining room and looked truly cornered. Finally, he exhaled through his nose, a controlled release that sounded like surrender. Fine, he said. But if we go with rules. Emma's lips barely moved, not quite a smile. Agreed. The decision settled over the house like a drop in temperature. Somewhere beyond the windows, London carried on carriages rattling, vendors calling, laughter spilling from open doors, unaware that a scorched rose had just set two people on a path that would end in gunpowder. Emma reached for the rose and lifted it by the stem. The thorns pressed gently through her glove. She held it up to the light and watched the blackened edges catch the sun. The flower fades when the sun sets. Emma set it down again, careful, deliberate, as if placing evidence on a table. Midnight, she said. Sebastian's jaw tightened. Midnight? He echoed. And in the space between the two words, the quiet war inside Harriet House sharpened into something with a clear target. Midnight turned Lord Elling's mansion into a breathing thing. Candlelight pulsed behind tall windows. Music spilled into the gardens in bright, careless waves, then dulled at the edges of hedges and stone. Inside, the air was thick with perfume, sweat, and velvet. Masks flashed, gilded smiles, painted mouths, blank porcelain eyes. Emma moved through it like she belonged to the shadows between bodies. Her domino was midnight blue, her silver mask caught light and threw it away. The pocket pistol, hidden in the folds of her skirt, dragged at the silk with a steady weight, a reminder pressed against her thigh each time she stepped. Across the room, Sebastian stood near the balcony doors, dressed as a highwayman. Black coat and dark mask, the irony sharp enough to taste. His posture was too rigid to be convincing. He looked like a man playing at danger while drowning in it. The devil arrived without announcement. A figure in a red domino cut through the crowd with a rolling, predatory gait that did not match Mayfair manners. A devil mask sat on his face, grinning wide in painted malice. Silas Vane. Even disguised, he carried himself like someone used to streets that did not forgive weakness. Emma watched him lean close to Sebastian, close enough that the brim of the devil mask nearly brushed the highwayman's. Sebastian's shoulders tightened. Vane's gloved hand patted his own chest, left breast pocket, a taunt that needed no words. Then Vane jerked his head toward the balcony. Sebastian hesitated for the smallest beat, then followed. Emma counted silently 10 breaths, controlled, and even then drifted after them, letting the crowd swallow her. The balcony was long and shadowed, stone cold beneath the thin soles of her shoes. Beyond the balustrade, the garden lay in darkness, the fountain's faint churn a soft, constant threat. Vane's voice carried here low and graveled. "Tired of scraps, Your Grace? The price has gone up." Sebastian's reply was steady but tight. "You will take what you are owed and leave." Vane chuckled, the sound like a match struck in a dirty room. "I want the deed to Sussex, and a seat where money breathes East India. Imagine it. Mr. Vane respectable." "That is impossible," Sebastian said. "Then the Morning Chronicle gets a history lesson," Vane murmured. "And perhaps your pretty wife has an accident. Horses can be so skittish." Emma stepped from behind the pillar. The silk of her skirt whispered once. The silver mask hid her expression, but her voice did not hide anything. "The only accident here," she said, "will be yours." Sebastian's head snapped toward her, horror widening his eyes. "Emma, get back!" Vane turned, amused. "The little Duchess!" he purred. "Isn't this sweet?" His hand dipped into his coat. Emma's gaze locked on his left breast pocket. The oilskin pouch, proof, sealed against rain and betrayal. But Vane's fingers found steel instead. A knife flashed in the moonlight. "Give my husband the letters," Emma said, lifting her right hand. The pocket pistol rose, small and deadly, aimed at Vane's chest. Vane's devil's smile widened. "Toy gun," he sneered, trembling hand. "You won't shoot. You don't have the stomach for blood." He stepped toward her. Sebastian lunged. The movement was a blur black coat, red domino, the scrape of shoes on stone. Vane pivoted fast and drove his elbow into Sebastian's ribs with brutal accuracy. Sebastian folded with a sharp cry, one hand clutching his side. Vane turned back to Emma, breathing hard, delighted. "Now," he said, "let's teach you what happens when women interrupt men." He lunged. Emma did not flinch. She did not blink. She saw the ace of spades in her mind the way some people saw prayer. She fired. The shot was not the thunder of a dueling pistol. It was a hard, sharp pop. Smoke puffed white and bitter. The smell of sulfur snapped through the night air. Vane jerked back with a roar, clutching his shoulder. The knife clattered to the balcony floor. "The letters!" Emma snapped, and Sebastian moved despite pain, tackling Vane in a desperate collision of fabric and fury. They slammed into the balustrade. Stone scraped. Vane twisted, strong, even wounded, and shoved Sebastian off with a grunt. With his good hand, Vane yanked the oilskin pouch from his coat and held it up like a priest, raising a sacrament. "You want it?" he snarled, blood running down his arm. He extended it over the dark garden. Below, the fountain churned, a mouth waiting. Sebastian surged forward. "No," Vane laughed. "If I drop it, the ink runs, proof dies, but I can still tell the world." He flicked his wrist. The pouch sailed, not down, but outward into the black tangle of hedges. "Fetch," Vane spat, grinning. Sebastian's gaze snapped to the flying packet, then back to Vane, torn in half by instinct. "Go!" Emma shouted. Her voice cut through the music behind them, through the night, through fear itself. "Find it! I have him!" Sebastian hesitated for a fraction, just long enough to see his wife standing alone with a pistol and a wounded predator. Then he vaulted the balustrade and dropped into the garden below, vanishing into shrubs with a wet crash. Emma and Vane were alone. Vane swayed slightly, breath ragged. His devil mask was smeared with blood at the edge. "You emptied your chamber," he wheezed. "Those ladies' toys fail. They always do." Emma's finger tightened on the trigger. Click. The sound was small, precise, obscene. Misfire. Cold rushed through Emma's veins. The pistol suddenly felt like dead weight. Vane's grin was all teeth. He bent, retrieved his knife, and straightened slowly, savoring the moment. "Now," he whispered, "I'm going to kill you." Emma stepped back until the stone railing pressed against her spine. There was nowhere to retreat but open air. Inside, the waltz continued. bright and unaware, masking her heartbeat. Vane raised the blade. A shadow detached from above, silent as soot. An older man dropped from the roofline with controlled force, boots landing without panic. A heavy cane swung once. Crack. Wood met skull with a sound like a door splitting. Vane crumpled instantly, devil mask tilting at an unnatural angle, his knife skittering across stone. Emma's breath left her in a sharp gasp. Her hands gripped the railing so hard her gloves creaked. The man straightened. He wore plain gray, his face hard as granite, eyes scanning the balcony like a ledger. "Sloppy," he said, voice clipped, "but courageous." Emma stared. "Who?" "John Townsend," he replied, tipping his hat as if greeting her at tea. "Bow Street runner." His gaze flicked to Vane's unconscious body. "We've been watching him for months, waiting for him to slip." He looked back at Emma. "Your husband is hunting for papers in the bushes. I suggest you go help him. I'll handle the trash." Emma did not wait for permission. She gathered her skirts and ran, boots slipping on the stone steps to the garden. Damp grass grabbed at her hems. The air smelled of wet leaves and fountain water, cleaner than the perfume inside. She found Sebastian on his knees in the mud near the fountain, hands frantic in the ivy. His breath came in harsh pulls. His black mask hung crooked, revealing a face too young for the fear carved into it. "Sebastian," Emma said, and the word sounded like a rope thrown across water. He looked up, eyes wild. In his hands, sealed and slick with moisture, was the oilskin pouch. "I found it," he rasped, clutching it to his chest as if it were a heart. "It's safe." Emma dropped to her knees beside him, mud soaking into her skirt without consequence. For a moment, neither of them moved, only breathed, the fountain's churn filling the silence. Then Sebastian pulled her into his arms. The embrace was not polite. It was desperate, fierce, his body shaking as he buried his face against her neck. She could smell rain and sweat and blood on him, and underneath it, something raw relief sharp enough to hurt. "I thought he would kill you," Sebastian choked. His voice broke on the last word. Emma closed her eyes. Her knees finally began to tremble now that it was allowed. "I had a misfire," she admitted. Sebastian pulled back, staring at her as if seeing the cliff she had stood on. His hand cupped her cheek with trembling care. Townsend," he breathed, recognizing the name with fresh dread. "If he finds these—" "He won't," Emma said. She looked at the pouch, then at Sebastian. The oilskin gleamed damply in the lantern light. Proof, shame, a father's treason condensed into paper. "Burn them," Emma said, voice steady again. "Burn them now." Sebastian's throat worked. He nodded once, sharp, like a decision made under fire. He fumbled a silver tinderbox from his pocket, hands shaking too much to be graceful. The first spark failed. The second caught. Flame licked the oilskin's corner. A bitter smell rose as the seal began to curl. Paper blackened, then flared, edges folding into ash that drifted on the night air. Emma watched the letter's roots, manifests. Betrayal turned to fragile gray. The ash floated down into the fountain and disappeared, swallowed without ceremony. When the last ember died, Sebastian looked at her as if he had been emptied and remade in the same breath. "You saved my life," he said. "I intend to win," Emma replied, and tried to shape a smile through the wetness on her face. Sebastian stepped closer. His eyes held hers with an intensity that made the garden feel smaller. "The wager is over," he murmured. "But He did not finish. He kissed her. Not a dutiful press, not a performance for rooms full of watchers. This was relief and adrenaline and heat sparked in gunpowder. His hands anchored at her waist, firm as if he feared she might vanish. Emma's fingers curled into his coat, feeling the damp wool, the steady thud of his heart. For a breath, the world softened. Then a boy's shout cut through the night beyond the gate, sharp as a thrown stone. "Telegram," the boy cried. "Telegram for the Duke of Harriet." Sebastian broke the kiss, blinking as if waking. He took the paper under the carriage lamp's weak light. Emma watched his eyes move across the lines. The color drained from his face. "What is it?" she asked, her voice low. Sebastian's hand tightened until the telegram crumpled. "It's from the king's court," he whispered, and the words came out like frost. Someone has challenged the validity of our marriage. He looked at her with a new, different horror, one that did not smell like sulfur, but like law. They claim the license was forged, he said. They are coming to take you away, Emma. And in the distance, inside the mansion, the waltz kept playing as if nothing in London ever truly changed. Doctors' Commons smelled like paper that had been breathed on by too many sanctimonious men. The air was dry, tinged with ink, dust, and the faint sourness of damp wool steaming under too many bodies packed into too little space. Wooden benches creaked with every shift. A clerk's quill scratched steadily, indifferent to the lives it was recording. Emma sat with her back straight, hands folded, gloves immaculate. The ring on her finger felt heavier in this room, not because it had changed, but because everyone here had come to decide whether it meant anything at all. She was not permitted to sit beside Sebastian. The separation was deliberate, a small cruelty disguised as protocol. He sat across the aisle, rigid on his bench, jaw clenched so tightly the muscle jumped near his ear. His hands were locked together, knuckles white, as if he were restraining something violent and necessary. The gallery behind them was full. Faces she recognized from assembly rooms filled the courtroom now, hungry and gleaming. Ladies leaned toward one another behind fans. Gentlemen watched with the bright-eyed attention reserved for gambling tables and executions. The scandal had brought them like a bell. At the center of the room stood Archibald Belinda. He wore black, sober, and perfectly cut, his hair neat, his hands soft. His expression carried a practiced sorrow, the kind that could be performed without ever being felt. Emma had seen men like him in drawing rooms, pleasant, harmless, forgettable. Here, with a court behind him, he looked like a blade polished to appear respectable. "My lords," Archibald began, voice smooth enough to slide under doors, "it brings me no joy to bring this suit, but the sanctity of the dukedom is at stake." He turned slightly, presenting his profile to the gallery as if it were a portrait. "My cousin the Duke is known for erratic behavior, drinking, gambling, recklessness." A murmur drifted through the room, soft and approving. Emma felt it press against her skin like cobweb. "And we all know the story," Archibald continued, letting the words hang just long enough to invite the audience to supply its own cruelty. "A wager, a spectacle, a duel. Is this the behavior of a sane man entering a holy union?" He pivoted toward Emma, and his eyes held a cold satisfaction. "Or," he said, lowering his voice into something that sounded almost tender, "is it the madness of a man coerced by a woman seeking to entrap him?" Entrap. The word struck the room and stuck, like gum under a pew. Emma felt heat climb her throat, not from shame but from fury. She did not move. She did not flinch. She refused to give Archibald the satisfaction of visible pain. Archibald produced a ledger, holding it up with careful fingers as if it were scripture. "And now we find," he said, "that the special license so conveniently purchased was never properly registered." A clerk handed up a paper, stamps and lines of ink that were meant to look final. "There is no record," Archibald said, voice rising. "No registry entry. Without it, the marriage is a fiction. Lady Emma is not a duchess in the eyes of law or church." A few gasps, pleased rather than shocked. Emma heard a quiet laugh, quickly smothered. At the front bench, the Bishop of London leaned forward. His eyebrows were heavy, caterpillar thick, making his face look permanently disapproving. "Your Grace," the bishop addressed Sebastian, "how do you answer?" Sebastian stood. The movement was controlled, but Emma saw the strain in it, the way his shoulders squared as if bracing for impact. His face looked older than it had a week ago, lines carved by sleeplessness and fear. But when he spoke, his voice did not shake. "My lords," Sebastian said, "my cousin speaks of madness and coercion. It is true that my marriage began with a wager. I was arrogant. I was a fool." He paused and looked across the aisle at Emma. His gaze softened for a fraction, ignoring the crowd as if they were wallpaper. "But the license was real," he continued. "I purchased it myself. If the record is missing, it is because thievery is afoot, not deceit." Archibald scoffed, loud enough to draw a few sympathetic smiles. "Thievery," he echoed. "A convenient excuse. Perhaps the Duke would like to explain why he married a spinster with no dowry, no powerful connections, and a reputation for being odd." Emma felt the eyes turn to her again, sharp and delighted. A lady in the gallery whispered something behind her fan. Emma heard only the hiss of breath and the faint click of a ring against wood. Archibald spread his hands, as if offering reason to the court. Unless, of course, the Duke's mind was clouded by spirits. Sebastian's hands clenched at his sides. Emma saw the impulse in him rage, the desire to leap across the aisle and silence Archibald with something less civilized than law. Instead, Sebastian lifted his chin. "I married her," he said, and his voice rose, clean and undeniable, "because she is the only person in this city with a spine. I married her because she is my equal." The statement rippled through the room, not as romance, but as shock. A duke had spoken of equality. The word tasted offensive to people who lived on hierarchy. "Sentiment does not constitute proof," Archibald snapped, pouncing. "The law requires a document. Without the registry, she is nothing." The bishop's gavel struck wood. The crack was sharp, final, and the entire room obeyed it. "The court will adjourn," the bishop declared. 3 days. Emma's stomach dropped. "The Duke has 72 hours," the bishop continued, "to produce the physical copy of the license or proof of registry. If he cannot, the union will be declared null and void." A wave of sound rose, whispers swelling into excited murmurs, the tongue feeding on the deadline like it was fresh meat. "Lady Emma will be returned to her family," the bishop added. "The Duke's estate will be placed under trusteeship pending resolution, with Mr. Archibald Belinda as executor." Archibald's mouth did not smile, but his eyes did. Sebastian's head snapped toward Emma, panic flashing across his face so quickly it looked like pain. As the court began to break, chairs scraping, skirts rustling, Emma stood with controlled grace, as if her body were not full of nausea and fury. The ring on her finger felt like a weight dragging her toward the floor, and she forced her hand to remain still. Outside, the sky was a flat gray. Carriages waited like vultures. The air smelled of rain and horse sweat and London's constant smoke. Harriet House that evening was quieter than the church had been. Servants moved along corridors without meeting Emma's eyes. Footsteps were muffled by thick carpet, but the silence was not soft. It was tense, brittle, listening. Sebastian tore through the library as if violence could summon paper from air. Drawers were yanked open. Books thudded onto the floor. A stack of documents hit the wall and scattered, pages fluttering like wounded birds. "It has to be here," he shouted, voice cracking. "I put it in the safe. I know I did." Emma stood by the fireplace, hands clasped in front of her, watching him destroy his own house in desperation. The fire snapped softly, a small sound that felt obscene against his panic. "Sebastian," she said, her voice low. He froze mid-motion, chest heaving. His eyes were wild, bright with terror. "They're going to take you away," he whispered, as if saying it aloud might make it real faster. "They're going to annul us." He stumbled toward her, and then, in a movement that stripped every ounce of pride from him, he sank to his knees. He buried his face against her skirt, clutching fabric as if it were the only thing anchoring him to the world. "I will lose you," he choked. I cannot lose you." Emma's hand lifted and settled on his hair. His scalp was warm beneath her palm. His breathing shuddered like a man trying not to drown. The room smelled of dust, paper, and smoke. Emma stared into the fire and felt something harden inside her, cold and clear. This was no longer about being called Duchess. It was about being erased, and she had never survived this long by allowing other people to write her ending. Carlton House glittered like a threat. Gold leaf caught the afternoon light and turned it into something sharp. The air inside smelled of sugared fruit, hot wax, and too much perfume layered over nervous sweat. Footmen moved like silent machinery. Somewhere, a clock chimed with gentle cruelty, reminding everyone that 72 hours did not care about dignity. Emma walked beside Sebastian through a corridor lined with portraits that looked down as if judging the living for being louder than the dead. Her gloves were pristine. Her spine was straight. Inside her chest, her heart kept time with a different sound. The imagined crack of a pistol, the memory of smoke, the weight of consequences. They were ushered into the gold drawing room. The Prince Regent lounged on a velvet divan, corseted tightly, a sugared plum between two ringed fingers. His face held both indulgence and a strange kind of sharp attention, as if he could smell weakness the way hounds smelled blood. Archibald was already there. He stood near the window in somber black, hands folded, expression arranged into concerned virtue. He bowed when the prince glanced his way, a vulture pretending to be a pastor. "So," the prince regent said, licking sugar from his finger. His voice carried lazy amusement. "The lovers and the vulture! It is better than a play." "Your Royal Highness," Archibald began, earnest and smooth. "This is a legal matter. The church. The church is boring," the prince interrupted, waving a heavy hand. Rings clicked. "This week has been nothing but rain and taxes. I am owed entertainment." His gaze slid to Emma. "You are the woman who shoots," he said, almost pleased. "They say you put a ball through a playing card at distance." Emma curtsied, low and controlled. The fabric of her dress whispered against the floor. "It is true, Your Highness," she said. The prince's eyes shifted to Sebastian. "And you," he drawled, "you claim you love her, that this is not merely a drunkard's mistake." Sebastian's jaw tightened. He looked exhausted, but when he spoke, his voice was steady. "I love her more than my life," he said, "and I would stake my dukedom on it." The prince sat up slightly. Interest brightened his eyes. "A stake," he murmured. "I like stakes." Emma stepped forward before Archibald could reclaim the room. The gold around them made her feel as if she were standing inside a jeweled trap. She kept her hands still. She kept her voice clear. "My husband's cousin claims our marriage is invalid because a piece of paper is missing," Emma said. "He claims I am unfit. He claims I entrapped him." Archibald's lips pressed into a thin line. Emma continued, each word placed carefully, like a coin on a scale. "I propose a test. If I prove by skill that I am who the public believes me to be, then Your Highness uses your royal prerogative to validate our marriage, regardless of the missing registry." The prince's mouth curled. "And if you fail?" Emma felt Sebastian's gaze on her, hot with alarm. She did not look at him. If she looked, she might feel what was at stake too clearly. "Then I will sign the annulment myself," Emma said, "and enter a nunnery." Sebastian made a sound, half protest, half disbelief. Emma lifted one gloved hand and pressed it lightly against his fingers, a silent command. "Not now." The prince clapped once, delighted. "Marvelous!" Archibald stepped in smoothly, eyes narrowing. He could smell a trap, but he also saw a stage. "If there is to be a test," Archibald said, voice sweet with venom, "let it be a real challenge, not a stationary card." He pointed through the tall window toward the gardens, where clipped hedges and rose bushes lay in ordered beauty. "The apple shot," Archibald said. The phrase landed with a hiss. "Let the Duke stand at 30 paces and hold an apple in his hand. If she can shoot it away, she wins. If she misses." He shrugged slightly, feigning regret. "Well, then she is a widow, and the problem resolves itself." The room went silent. Even the prince's amusement paused, caught on something sharp. The distance was obscene. A pistol did not forgive an inch. Emma's breath tightened. For the first time in hours, fear tried to climb into her throat. Sebastian spoke before she could. "Acceptable," he said. Emma's head turned toward him, a crack in her composure. "Sebastian." "No," Sebastian said softly, but with a firmness she had never heard from him. His eyes were clear, almost calm. "If this is the only way to keep you, then yes." Archibald watched them with a faint gleam, as if he could already taste the accident. The prince's lips parted, pleased again. 10 minutes, he ordered. To the lawn. The court spilled into the gardens as if poured from a cup. Footsteps crunched softly on gravel. The air outside was cooler, smelling of clipped boxwood and damp soil. Clouds hung low, turning the light flat and unforgiving. Sebastian walked to the mark near a rose bush and stopped. A footman handed him a small green apple. Its skin was taut and shiny, beaded with moisture. Sebastian held it on his outstretched palm. He did not shake. He looked at Emma with a steadiness that made her chest ache. It was not bravado. It was trust, absolute and terrifying. Emma stood 30 paces away. Colonel Holloway's pistols had not been brought here, but Sebastian's own Manton was. The metal was cool through her gloves. It felt heavier than it had ever felt, as if the weight of the entire city had been melted into the barrel. The spectators gathered in a wide arc, faces pale with anticipation. Archibald stood to one side, hands clasped, already composing his morning speech. The Prince Regent leaned forward, eyes bright, rings flashing. Emma raised the pistol. For a heartbeat, her vision narrowed too hard. The apple was not a target. It was her husband's hand, his pulse, the bone beneath his skin. Her stomach turned. She lowered the weapon a fraction, just enough for Doubt to breathe. Archibald's voice slid in, soft and taunting. "Shoot, Duchess, or admit defeat." Emma's jaw tightened. The insult was bait. The true hook was Sebastian's silence, his refusal to rescue her from her own choice. Emma drew in a slow breath. Her left hand moved without drama. She slipped off her glove. Cool air hit her skin. The tip of her index finger showed a thin, faint callus, nothing grotesque, nothing romantic, simply evidence. Years, repetition, control. She pulled the glove back on, sealing the proof away as if closing a blade. Then she lifted the pistol again. Her shoulders lowered, her grip adjusted. The world began to thin. The crowd blurred. Archibald's black suit became a smear. Even the prince's jewelry turned to distant sparks. The apple sharpened. Emma heard, not words, but rhythm. A steady internal count, a breath measured the way distance was measured. Noise fell away. Target, silence. Sebastian's eyes stayed on hers, unblinking, as if he were anchoring her aim with his trust. Emma exhaled. Her finger squeezed. The crack split the air. Smoke burst white and bitter. Sulfur slapped the back of her throat. For a fraction of a second, the world disappeared behind haze. When it cleared, Sebastian was still standing. His hand was still outstretched. But it was empty. The apple was gone, obliterated into a wet spray that speckled the rose leaves behind him. Tiny fragments of green skin clung to petals like confetti from a violent celebration. No one moved. Then Sebastian smiled. It was not the careless smile of a man who expected to win. It was the stunned, grateful smile of a man who had just survived on faith. He lowered his hand and bowed, slow and deliberate, to Emma. The Prince Regent roared with delight, clapping so hard his rings clicked. "Bravo!" he bellowed. "By God, bravo!" Archibald's face tightened as if he had swallowed something sour. The prince's laughter dropped into something colder as he turned toward him. "You have bored me," he said. "And you have annoyed a duchess who can shoot a flea off a dog's ear?" Archibald tried to speak, but no sound came. "I am the Prince Regent," the prince snapped, voice swelling again. "If I say they are married, they are married." A clerk stepped forward with papers. Ink, a stamp. The heavy thud of authority pressed onto parchment like a seal on flesh. Sebastian crossed the distance between them in 3 strides. He did not care about the court watching. He reached for Emma's hands as if to prove she was still there. "You did it," he whispered, voice raw. Emma's knees threatened to soften. She held herself upright anyway, feeling the last traces of smoke cling to her lungs. "Yes," she said. In the background, Archibald stood very still, as if the garden itself had turned against him. And for the first time since the court began to pick at their marriage like carrion, the air tasted clean. Harriet House did not change overnight, but it began to breathe differently. The corridors felt less like a museum and more like a home in the making. Curtains were drawn back in the mornings. Windows opened. Fresh air moved through rooms that had once held only polish and silence. The servants' footsteps were still quiet, always quiet in a house that respected hierarchy, but their eyes were no longer skittish. They carried trays with steadier hands, as if the walls had stopped listening for disaster. In the garden, someone had finally cut back the weeds. The gravel paths reappeared like old bones uncovered. Rose bushes were trimmed. New stakes were driven into soil. The scent of damp earth rose stronger than perfume now, honest and clean. Emma sat beneath a pale sky with a book open in her lap, though her eyes drifted more often to the far end of the lawn than to the page. A wooden frame had been built there, simple and practical, holding paper targets that fluttered lightly in the breeze. A range. Not an ornament. A choice. The sound of footsteps approached behind her. Measured, familiar. Sebastian came down the garden steps, carrying 2 glasses of lemonade. The glass sweated in his hand, the condensation catching sunlight in small, bright beads. He wore a plain coat today. No dramatic cut, no armor of fashion. The lines at the corners of his eyes remained, carved by weeks that had forced him to become something sharper than arrogance. He handed one glass to Emma. Their fingers brushed. The touch was brief, but it carried the steady warmth of habit forming. He sat beside her on the bench. The wood creaked softly beneath his weight. For a moment, neither spoke. The garden filled the silence with small, ordinary sounds. A bird shifting in leaves, distant carriage wheels on the street beyond the gate, the faint scrape of a gardener's rake. Sebastian exhaled, long and quiet, as if releasing something he had been holding in his ribs for years. "A letter came," he said, reaching into his pocket. He placed the envelope on the small table between them. The paper was thin and slightly wrinkled, sealed poorly. It looked like pride had been swallowed to write it. Emma did not open it. She studied the handwriting, the way the ink pressed too hard on certain strokes. Desperation always left marks. Sebastian watched her face, searching for amusement, anger, satisfaction. He found composure instead, and something gentler beneath it. "He begs for a loan," Sebastian said, voice edged with disbelief. "Apparently the roof of his cottage is leaking." Emma's mouth curved slightly, not into a smile of victory, but into something quieter. She lifted her lemonade, felt the cool glass against her palm, and took a sip. The citrus tasted sharp and clean. "Send him a tarp," she said. Sebastian let out a short laugh, the sound low and real. It faded into silence that no longer felt like punishment. His gaze drifted toward the targets at the far end of the lawn. The paper circles fluttered again, small white mouths waiting. "I was thinking," Sebastian said, and his tone softened, cautious, as if he feared the thought might break if spoken too loudly. "The little one will need a tutor." Emma's free hand rested on her stomach. The curve beneath the fabric was still subtle, more promise than proof, but it was there, real, heavy in a way no ring had ever been. Her fingers spread slowly over it as if anchoring herself to the present. "Indeed," she said. Her voice held a calm certainty that made the future sound possible. "Latin? French? Piano?" Sebastian's eyes flicked to her hand, and something in his expression tightened, not fear this time, but awe mixed with a kind of tenderness that still looked unfamiliar on him. "And ballistics," he added, as if daring the world to object. Emma's gaze moved back to the range. The targets swayed. The air smelled of trimmed roses and newly turned soil. "Definitely ballistics," she said. Sebastian turned toward her fully then, his shoulder brushing hers. It was a simple contact, unremarkable to anyone watching, but it made the bench feel like an anchor. "I used to think winning meant escaping," he said quietly. "Out-drinking my boredom, outrunning expectations, being louder than everyone else." Emma looked at him over the rim of her glass. The sunlight caught the pale color of his eyes, made them almost clear. "And now?" she asked. Sebastian's throat worked once, a swallow that looked like humility. "Now I think winning looks like this," he said, gesturing with a small tilt of his head toward the garden. The house, the quiet order that had replaced chaos. A morning without dread. A room where silence isn't a weapon. Emma's fingers pressed lightly against her stomach again. The movement was small, instinctive, and it softened the sharp edges of her face. "You sound almost domesticated," she said dryly. Sebastian's mouth twitched. "Do not spread that rumor," he replied. "I have a reputation to maintain." The dark humor landed cleanly, and Emma's quiet laugh surprised her. It felt strange in her chest at first, like a door opening in a house that had been locked for too long. The wind shifted. One of the paper targets snapped against its frame with a soft slap. Sebastian's gaze followed the motion, then returned to Emma. "We should go," he said, "before the day gets away from us." Emma closed her book and stood carefully. Sebastian rose with her, reflexively offering his hand. She took it without hesitation. His grip was firm, warm, no longer cold with resentment. They walked together across the lawn. Grass brushed the hem of Emma's dress. The gravel path crunched underfoot. A servant appeared at the garden door, then quietly stepped back, as if even the household understood this was not a moment to interrupt. At the range, Sebastian adjusted the paper target, pinning it straighter. The edge of the paper rasped under his fingers. Emma watched him work, the simple act of care still strange on him, still new. He stepped back and offered her the pistol case. Emma took it. The wood felt solid, familiar, not a symbol of scandal now, but a tool she had earned the right to hold without apology. She loaded with practiced calm, powder, ball, a small, precise motion that smelled faintly of oil and metal. Sebastian stood beside her, not in front of her, not demanding proof, not wagering her life for his pride, just present. Emma lifted the pistol. The target steadied in her sight. She breathed in. The world narrowed. Then she lowered the weapon without firing and looked at Sebastian instead. His brows lifted slightly, questioning. Emma's eyes held his, gray and steady. The ring on her finger glinted once. The morning light warmed her skin. In London, people would always talk. They would always rewrite stories to preserve their own comfort. They would call her lucky. They would call her dangerous. They would call her anything except what she was. Emma slipped her glove tighter at the wrist, sealing her hand like a decision, and turned her gaze back to the paper. Power had tried to erase her. It had missed. In London, power flinches when the invisible aims.